Now this is beyond HTML and with Ajax and JSON. Okay, so this is where it comes to the point where you want to use JavaScript to access the server. Because normally JavaScript is a client-side scripting language, right? It has been many years. It still is, and it will continue to be. But it's also changing because now we have the server side of it. The Node.js allows you to interact with the servers now, so it's becoming kind of like both sides now, which is pretty cool. But nonetheless, it's still a very strong client-side language. Now, to be able to write your script to interact with the server, you need a different type of technologies to help. So JavaScript itself cannot do it. So that's why they came up with this new API called XMLHttpRequest. Okay, so this is actually a constructor itself. Just like how you create a constructor function, right? A function constructor. And then the idea is that now this API allows JavaScript to read data from a file which is stored on the server. Now it's still only on the server side. It does not read data file from your local machine, so it's still safe on the client side. So normally JavaScript can only read like cookie files and basically that's it, right? And write cookie files, that's all it can do because it's quite dangerous since it's on the client side. I mean, you imagine if I can do that and I write a really malicious code on my script and you run it and it deletes your local machine. That's horrible. So it's not safe. So with this one here, it allows you to reach over to the server side and read some data. I think that's all it does. Just reading data. I don't think it lets you write to it. You just only read it. Not only that, it also allows you to read the data and then populate those data to your screen without refreshing your screen. So there's no reload. Okay, it happens instantly. It happens seamlessly. I'm sure if you haven't tried it, you've seen it before. When you search for something on a search box or something, you type it, you click submit, and data just shows it right there without refreshing your screen, right? That's Ajax. Okay, so it takes a couple of technologies, mainly in XML. Initially, it was an XML file and the HTTP protocol and JavaScript. Okay, so those couple of technologies together, and then they form something called the Ajax, which is the acronym for Asynchronous, JavaScript, and XML. So Ajax right there. And also notice that XML, if you want to read XML file, you have to use server only. Okay, so you cannot. That's also the disadvantage of XML versus JSON data, because XML you need a server. JSON you don't have to. Okay, you can pass data over across any server with JSON data, just a text of a string of text basically. XML, it needs to live on a server, so that's the disadvantage, or advantage you want to call it if it's safe. So it's not a language, okay? It's an approach basically. It's a technique how to access data on a server using multiple technologies. You can send different kinds of data across the server using either JSON, XML, HTML file, or other text files, or even images. Okay, you can do that as well. The key here is the asynchronous nature. That means that while it's doing that interaction with the server, you want to make sure that it's set into the asynchronous mode. That means it will run this in the background while your page is doing other activities.
So how do you set that?
Yeah, it's a parameter, just a true or false, basically. Yeah, and if you don't set it, so that means if the file is so huge, or if that connection is keep dropping, then what you see is that you see the spinning glass on the screen, and your user is gonna go away. Okay, so while that's being done in the background, the user can still browse around and do other stuff. And then once that's been accessed and the data has been returned from the server, then it will, at the time, it will update the screen for the user. Okay.
How do you initiate the asynchronous?
Yeah, we're gonna go over that.
Oh,
Okay. So two major features: AJAX allows you to send data and receive data. Okay. Send requests. Requests would be like what kind of request you want to get. We'll see that in a minute here. So the syntax to create a request is, again, if you see the word new here, this is a constructor. So you basically write a variable just like how you do, new pet, same thing. But in this case, it would be XMLHttpRequest. Again, this is JavaScript, so it's case sensitive. You have to make sure everything is spelled exactly as is, uppercase, lowercase, and so on, right? And then once you do that, that's the first thing you should do. Create an object called myRequest, and then from that request, this constructor here has a lot of functions built into it. You can access this function. There's a whole list. I don't have it here, but there's a whole list of them. We're not going to do all of them. Maybe just only about 3 or 4 are most popular and widely used. The rest are for something else. So here is like the requirement. Its constructor here initiates the request. It must be called before any other methods. Okay, so you must call this first before you can actually run other functions. So here are the 2 steps to make the request. So if you follow this rule, this method here, it's always that process. And so usually you can write that piece of code later on. We'll show you the final finished product, and just paste it into somewhere in your code, and you use it again and again. So before I go with this list, I'm going to go to the bottom of this page, kind of show you what that will look like. So look at the finished product first, and then we'll go back. Okay, so here's a simple code. Just say I have a button here, and the HTML part has a button, has a type, has an ID code, AJAX button. You just say make a request, right? If you run that, you just see the button. So I could do something like this. Let me copy, put it here. And the HTML part, let me turn these off. Turn all of these off here. Okay, so here is the button, right? That's the button here. I put the script here. So if you run this, you'll see that it just say make a request, right? So once you click that make a request, then it's gonna call a function, and the function is here. Let me paste this in there so we can see. Right in here, and I'll go through each of these one at a time. So this is an anonymous function, right? From here to here, has no name, and this is a what's called a self-invoking function. It calls itself. The way you do is that you wrap the function with a parent in the front, and you wrap it at the end. Okay, and then you call it. This is a function call. Because there's no name, you call it this way. So normally you will see something like this in your function, right? You will see something like that, and then it has a name. With that, you can just say a function x, y, z or something, right? So this function is not being called until down here I say x, y, z, right? Then I call it from there. If you want to call it itself, this right now it would do exactly the same as it was before. So it's called a self-invoking function. It's an anonymous function, but now it has a name, which means I can use it again and again. If you don't want to do that, then take that out. You wrap the function, the whole thing, with a parentheses, and then so this whole thing here in yellow is like this part, and then I just need to invoke it. That. Okay, so you call the function right away. And if this function has a parameter like a, b, c, I mean not that one up here. If it's like a, b, c, right, 3 parameters, well, down here I could just pass data here, 1, 2, 3, right? Because this is the parameters, the arguments to pass to the function. Okay, it may look confusing, but you see this a lot in JavaScript. Okay, so now when you run this, so you run it, okay, it's running right now. If I refresh it, it's there. And then when I click it, it's going to make a request. So it basically put this, there's a problem with the request here. See? The reason is because it tells you here the test.html is not found. Okay. So let's trace this. when you click the button, then the request here says the document element by the Ajax button, right? I add the attachment of a event listener called click. Click is now attached to this button, and when I call it, it calls this function called make request. This function here, and then this function here will start the process. So as you can see, this function calls. The first thing it does is it make this this call. That's this one here. Let's go back up. This one here. Okay, instantiate an object of XMLHttpRequest. So once you do that, then the next thing is you want to make sure that it's actually accessible, because some older browsers doesn't have this option, like an IE8 for example. It doesn't work on IE8. Okay, so only new browsers. So if it fails, then it's going to have an error here. So this is just for testing. If it passed, then good. Go to the next part, the next line here. So again, you see it's in this order. This is just for testing, but you create an object out of that. You access this function called onReadyStateChange. This property. This property is part of this whole thing here. This constructor. So because this object is part of that, so if you look at this constructor, it will look something like this, right? Like the one we saw in the pet, like this. If this were the HTTP request, we have onReadyStateRequest, open, close, and send, and so on. So all those properties are in that object. So this one here, the open, the send, the ready state, okay, status, response text, all those are properties of this object. So once you make that, you check it, make sure it's compatible with the browser, and then you can check the state. In this state here, it calls the function. So I have a function name. If you don't have that, you could put this whole thing here, right here if you want, anonymous function, right? It will look something like that. But since that's pretty, it's very cluttered, so you can take that out and put it into a separate function, so you can see it better. You call that function, now you trace go down here, and then you check for the state. You check for the state, the ready state. HTTP request is done. Okay, and also I want to mention that when you run this, it doesn't really run in the exact order. Okay, it wouldn't make sense. So what happens is that you call this, but at the same time, it opens a connection to this file. Okay, and then it calls this file. So this happens really quick in the background, almost like simultaneously. And then it's gonna it's using what's called a get method. Get means read the data from this file, whatever the file is. It's gonna read it, and So while it's doing that, it's trying to do that, you need to check the state until it's done, until it's reading all the data from this file. Everything looks good, and then you check the status of a 200 value. The status means it's a good, it's a go. And then if it's okay, then you can go ahead and then print that message out. So the response text will store the value inside what this file is. Whatever it's containing there, it will retrieve all those data from the file and save it into this object called response text. Okay? And we'll print that out. In this case, we'll print that out through the alert message box. If there's an error, then it will say there's a problem with the request. We had that because, right, this error says it's a 404 value because this file was not in there. And if you look back here, I have a list of all the keys down here as well. So you have different type of error messages. Okay, this is very common. You've seen this before. When you try to run a site, go to a page or something, you see this kind of errors. Okay, you have the common one you see are probably like a 501 or 500, the internal server error, the 502, and you have the forbidden ones, right? Unauthorized, 401 and 403, very common. If the file is not found, you get a 404. 404 means the file or that whatever that is not found. That's why we have a 404, right? That means this file, whatever it is, not found. So you get different type of error messages. So we want to get a message of type 200. Okay, it's successful. Any message you get with the 1XX is for information only. The successful message would be for 200 something. 300 series is for redirection. Okay, it's like when you redirect a site to another site, you get those messages, and then you have error on the client side, you have error on the server side. So for a client, 5 is a server. Okay, so we want to get the 200. Make sure that everything's okay, successful. If that's so, then go ahead and then process the data. Okay, so we check that to make sure it's 200. This part here, their state, you want to check the state is done. Once it's done, then you check the status. So the done here, the state also has a list of numbers up here. You have about 5 different states as well. Some of these I think use numbers. You can also use the done here, the XML done. It's a capital letter, so that is a constant, right? So the constant has a value of 4 in this case. So you check, make sure it's done, it's completed. The request is finished, then it's ready to process. So if you don't receive, bless you, if you don't receive a value of 4 or done, then you know that it failed. Okay, once it failed, it doesn't have access to the file or something's wrong with it, so you can check it. Okay, so once that's done, then you check for the state. If the state is the 200, it's okay, successful, then you're good to go. So the process is you make the request. Okay, you make a function call the onReady state, and then this function here, this is very standard. You can copy and paste this and use this again and again. Okay, you'll see that everywhere will be similar to this. You check the state for done or not. If you want to be more specific, you can say if the state is a 1, then while it's 1 it's loading, or it's 2 it's done loading. If it's 3, you can do something else. You can do that in here as well. If state is XML that loaded or something, to do something else. And then if the state is done, they do something else. Right? You have those little phases in between. But if you don't really care about that, just let me know when it's done. Then you call that, and then you check the status to make sure it's okay, successful or not. Okay, if it's successful, then you go ahead and then do what you want to do here. From this point on, usually you call the function outside of your code and then you process the data. Here, I'm just saying display the data to the message window. Okay, so now the data has been returned from the server at this point, and so to this variable called response text, and I can process it, do whatever, right? So if you were to read this, it would look something like this. Even though I have it in this written down this way, you make the request, you open a connection with a GET request for this file, you send it, and then it checks for the state. It's like going in that order. Okay, and check for the state. So while it's doing this, because it's being done in the background, then you can go ahead and process your data. Okay, so let's go back here. So we make that object. We're going to call this function to process the data, and then we send it to the server, wherever the server is, right? It always has to be the same server as your file runs. You cannot access a different server, a different domain. And that's the rule, also for security reasons. So wherever this file is being run, let's just say if I have this file called debug.html, if I want to read this test.html, it has to reside on the same domain. I cannot put this over like google.com or another one of your domains. Okay, it won't work. So it doesn't allow cross servers or cross domains. So this is the URL, or the location of the file. Or here, this one here is true or false. This is where you will say asynchronous or synchronous, right? So asynchronous means don't force the user to wait, or don't force the browser to wait. You run this in the background. Okay, so by default it's true. If you want to force it, you set it to false, and then when you do that, then you see the spinning hourglass, and you don't want to do that. Okay, most of the time, probably 99% of the time, you don't want to do that unless you want to force your user to wait and for whatever reason. Okay, so if you don't put it there, it's defaulted to true anyway. It's going to be set to true. So you can use get. This is very common. You can also use different ones as well. You can use post. Yeah, post, get, post, head, and this list here has a whole bunch of them, like put, delete, and so on. We never get to use this, but because it's not very popular. The put here, the post will be something like, you know, how you can send a tweet through an API and put a message and send a tweet, and so that message sent to your Twitter account without you log into your Twitter account, for example, and the message will be posted automatically. So that would be one of those post method here. Instead of get, you will post it to the server. Okay, so you can send that data, and then on the server side, if you see it as a post, then it will post the data. Or if you post some data to your a bulletin board or a forum or something like that, right? So that's for that. So the get is mainly just to retrieve data. So the server is responsible for sending you the data. Okay, you want it. And then so here I just show you that the same have to be the same domain. If you change that URL to be a different domain, then it doesn't work. What that means is this file here. Right now I put test HTML. It's in the same domain. If I put something like HTTP, you know, some domain .com/ like this, and if this HTML, this debug file is not on this domain, then it will never reach the file. Okay, I've got the same server. So now let's just say if I create this file called test in here, in the same location, a new HTML file. It could be HTML, it could be just text, it's fine, but we call it test HTML since we named it that way. And we'll just put test here. Okay. So now when I run this, it should call and then get this file called test, which I created here. There's nothing in there yet. It's just a bunch of HTML text. So what you get is it's going to read everything here, all this as text, and return this as a string, as a long string, to this object called response text. Okay, and then I can print that out to the screen. Okay, so if I will go back and then refresh here, okay, and if I click make a request, so you see that it returns back successfully, and it has the file, the data what I just showed you here, right? The HTML.
So it's supposed to look like that?
Yeah.
Okay, I was a little confused.
Yeah, so it returns the data, whatever the data is, inside this text file. In this case, that's HTML file.
Alrighty.
Call it that. Okay. So if this is where, let's just say, have a if it's like a text file, you could have something like data .txt, and here I could put like you know, the JSON data, right? You could just say name, and then colon Tom, okay, and then we put favorite, or put car, like that. So that's a text file inside this text. I can now change this, instead of looking for this text file, I want to get that data.text. Okay, so it's going to call this file, call it, reads whatever is in here, return everything back to whatever that is. So let's refresh this, save it. You see that it returned as that string. Okay, this is a JSON string. So with that, I can now, instead of just printing this out to the screen, I could write a function down here somewhere, like process data, and I'll pass that data here to the function, and then here I'm going to turn this off, and I'll just say, if it's successful, then process the data, and the data is going to be HTTP request.response text. Okay, it stores in this text object. And here, the data is in here. So now the data is exactly like this. Okay. If you don't want that, it could be just something like that. Right? However you want it. If it's like that, then again, if I run it, okay, you get that string there. What I had before, I had something like that. I had a curly. And then if you run it again, there's a curly on it. So now you could do something like, okay, so I want like var, I don't know, JSON is equal to data. Okay. And let's see if I put, if I print like console.log JSON, let's see what that looks like. It's going to print to the console. Okay, so you can see that it has a string here. But it's a string. So when you write your text, really, I think you don't need that curlies there. It will look just a string text like that, maybe. Let's try again. It look like that string. And then because that's a string, then usually you want to convert to a JSON data, so it will look something like that. Right? Or object. Let's see what I had earlier. I had yeah, before we get there. so I hope you get it now, right? You create that request, send it, the get, and then the URL to that file. Again, if I put this into a different domain, if I put like http google.com/data text, for example, if I do that, then you're going to get an error because this one is not allowed. I'm using a different server now. If I refresh, If I click it, you see that it says access control origin is not allowed, right? Therefore not allow access. So it doesn't work. I get a 404. Well, let me do it. So it's a safety feature built into it. And so your data starts